and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome again Professor Adolf Sotoca from Politechniki de Catalunya from Barcelona. Most of you met him a month ago, but Professor Sotoca is our visiting professor for 14 years already coming here every 1 or 2 semesters, and he's specializing in urban design, in urban planning, but also in architecture, environmental problems of contemporary cities. He has a great wide of projects he participated in. He was also a visiting professor in numerous schools in ETH Zurich, in Urbana-Champaign in the United States, in Luleå University in Sweden, but most importantly in here, in Politechnika Krakowska. So, it's my pleasure to announce this public lecture, this year public lecture entitled, as you see, Telling Landscapes, Short Stories for a Shared Narrative. And I give floor back to Professor Sotoca. Welcome.
Thank you, Mateusz. Thank you all for attending this lecture. When I was asked to prepare the lecture today, I thought to prepare a different lecture from the ones that I typically prepare. This one is going to be a very personal one. I'm at the point of telling what I have done so far, which is not that common for scholars. We are so focused in advancing, in preparing new proposals, and in being on the cutting edge of research. But that is the case that it's not that common that we have the time to reflect on what we have done in the past, right? So today, I'm going to tell you a story, very much embedded in my personal experience. Because, and this is behind this title here, Stories and Narratives, it's something fundamental that we, scholars and researchers in the scientific field, we are trained to explore and to gain knowledge. But maybe what is missing sometimes is to be able to communicate what we have learned throughout the process. And researching and learning, and you know well enough as well, it's a personal experience. So today I'm gonna try to explain what I've learned in a small portion of my apprentice in the last years through explaining you a short story on sustainability. As Professor Jurkovic mentioned, in the last years, I've been very much focused on sustainability. And from there, I will try to jump to the narrative concept, which is not theory. I'll come to that at the end of the session, but it's good that you keep in mind this focus on just telling a story. There have been many attempts to build a narrative and to tell story about sustainability. I'm not original in that sense. There is a long tradition of scholars, researchers, that have been advocating for a theory, for a way of looking at things through the concrete experience or the particular explanation of concrete specific case studies. And this is very important. Talking or building upon concrete specific realities. It's not that we are producing theory out of scratch, out of nothing, but we architects are very much embedded, very much committed to specific realities. Those realities that we can touch, we can walk through, we can understand through our senses, not only from the desk, from our table, from data, as it is the case for some fields of knowledge and natural sciences, but our knowledge is very much embedded in society. So it's very important for us to understand and to experience the concrete realities. There are many examples, as I mentioned, and dealing with this understanding of specific realities. Some of them are very well acknowledged when it comes to sustainability and the relationship between cities and the environmental issues that these cities are embedded in. For instance, I would like to quote here the work by Rainer Banham, maybe you know him, Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. For those of you who are not familiar with this book, I strongly recommend you to go through it because there are many lessons how to explain a story and how to identify critical issues by paying attention to small details. Those things that we can see, architecture that we can understand through just visiting, looking at it in a careful way. So Los Angeles, this architecture for ecologists, but there have been more recently other architects, planners, urban geographers, that they have been paying attention to the concreteness of particular cities. And they built a kind of narrative. I couldn't dare to say those are theories, but at least narratives that help us to understand those socio-environmental processes. As a case in point, I could mention Gray Brechin Imperial San Francisco, where the relationship between the emergence of a new economy in the San Francisco Bay Area is explained in terms of the relation of the city with mining, with the appropriation of natural resources. As for the case of Ecuador, social power and the urbanization of water is a masterpiece when it comes to explain how different economies, and in this case, it goes from the banana economy to the cacao economy and then the oil economy, these very basic primary sectors, extractive activities, and how these different economies translate onto the physical space. In this case, the city of Guayaquil, in the coast of Ecuador. More recently, also, an author that I'm very fond of is Matthew Gandhi, the urban critical geographer, and that he wrote this book about New York, concrete and clay, and how the city was built by making a very wise usage of natural resources surrounding the city, and the fabric of space, which is a compilation, a addition of several narratives in several cities across the planet, from Berlin to Laos to Mumbai, Lagos, many different cities across the planet. What all these narratives have in common is that they explain a different version of a story. It's not about urban morphology. It's not about only architecture. We'll see that they use architecture as a disclosing device so that we can better understand what's happening in deeper grounds or deeper levels of societies. But they relate this story to environmental issues, the availability of water, the usage of energy flows, etc. And this is becoming more and more important in the scientific agenda for us as scholars working with these issues. So I spent a big deal of time trying to understand these narratives, and yes, it's working now. And yes, in my case, as Professor Jurkovic mentioned, I had the opportunity to be based in several countries in the last 10, 12 years. I've been living in the Midwest, in the American Midwest, in close area to Chicago. I've been also living in Ecuador. I've been living in Germany and in Sweden. In each case, a couple of years each, right? So I have had this opportunity of having a very wide understanding of what's going on in the world. Being each one of these locations a particular case study. So it's not that I try to explain you today a global, universal theory about urbanization processes and the relationship with the environment. I don't believe in theory as a big word, right? I strongly believe that each site, each city, each culture, each geographical context has its own story, right? Its own particularity. But there are some common issues that we can extract so that a common narrative, a shared narrative, which is the part of the title of the lecture today, can be found and identified. So in red, those are the locations where I've been living in the last 10, 12 years. And I am originally from this area here, from Barcelona, from where I'm based at the moment. So, as I said, the intent of the lecture today is not to tell you a global history of environmental issues when it comes to urbanization processes. This is what Buckminster Fuller, if you are familiar with the map, the Maxion map that you see here, the global map by Buckminster Fuller, that's very much a paradigm of global understanding, of generic knowledge. Buckminster Fuller is the epitome, I could say, of this modernistic way of understanding knowledge. This idea of general ideas that could be applied all over the planet, right? The epitome of that is the dome over New York, right? That's his most acknowledged project, as a kind of pilot project that could be extended and applied all over the planet. If you remember that project, the idea was to keep a sustainable environment within a dome, right? Understanding that the city is the node, the hub for a change of materials, energy flows, water flows in the city. So the main goal, the ultimate goal, would be to balance the change of flows with the environment and protect that particular environment from the non-desired externalities of the environment by building that dome. So it's not the intent of my lecture today, but I like to use this confrontation between general theory and the more concrete characteristics, right? So I will focus today, and I will tell you among these stories, I have one story for each one of these locations, right? Today, I will focus on just one of them, the one in Germany, and I will try to disclose what kind of relationships can we find between architecture, society, economy, and the coding and the regulations of it all through the exploration of the environmental balance between environment and the architecture or urban development. I developed this theory after I've been living in Germany during my PhD dissertation, and this is the typical landscape. We will start by looking in a very simple way to what we see. This is the typical landscape of the area I was based on. This is the Siegen region in central Germany, where you can see a typical landscape. What you see here, if I ask you, what do you see? I like to interact with the audience. What do you see here in this image? Very simple question. There is no trick behind this. What do you see? Houses. Good. Are they the same? Are they different? They are similar. There are some similarities. Where do you find the similarities? In the shape? The size? Or, Where are they located? Suburbs. Do you see when you refer to suburbs, what do you have in mind? It's a modern suburb in the American way, or it's a village? It's a village. Okay. Okay, good. What do you see more? How do you get to these houses? Is there any kind of infrastructure here? Besides the architecture itself, we need roads, right? We need electricity coming in. What do these people, do you see here? Behind the houses? Yes? What do they make a living of, these people living here? Any farming? Okay. And when it comes to the similarities, what is familiar or common in these architectural devices? Let's call them like that. Size, you mentioned? Shape? Okay. The roof is steep roof, right? So that tells us something about the climate, maybe. They need to defend themselves from climate conditions, or they need to evacuate rainwater in the fastest possible way, for instance, right? The openings, the windows, you mentioned that. They are not glassed windows. I mean, they are very protected from the environment, right? That's because maybe the weather is cold here. It's not a tropical weather. It's not like we have this interface or these buffers in tropical weathers, the porticos, and the materials maybe, and the relationship with the soil. Well, we'll get to that later on. So, in order to disclose these particularities of singularities of each one of the elements, but at the same time, what do they have in common? We need to have a sharp look at things, right? It's not enough by looking at things, but we need to have an intention. We need to look for something. And this is precisely what this couple did during the 60s, 70s. These are, it's my pleasure to introduce you Bernd and Hilla Becher. They are photographers, Swiss photographers, and they developed many or several research projects, artistic and research, both, during the 60s and 70s. And they devoted their life, and you can see here how they were devoted, even bringing family here, the children, to their work, to their field work, in recording, registering the materiality, what was happening there. What could we see there? To see there and to analyze that and to extract some conclusions by analytical and very objective description of what we can see on the landscape. Actually, they are the most prominent representative of the artistic movement, which is called Neue Sachlichkeit. In German, that means new objectivity. And they were, and they are still, quite famous. They have been exhibiting their work all over the place, all over the world, and they are very well acknowledged. Here you see them preparing an exhibition in Bern many years ago. And what you can see here is the result, the outcomes of their research project. One of them, which is what we can see here. Yes. Again, this is the outcome of some of the research projects. Again, I will ask you, what do you see in common here? The elevation, structure. Develop a little bit more on that, if you wish. If you wish, if you can, develop a little bit. Yes, which is not in timber. It is in what? In stone or? And what might be the reason for that? And? Foundations. We can guess that the terrain, the soil is not very stable. It's muddy or clay, so we need a solid foundation. Maybe they want to avoid humidity to go up, so that's why they are using stone as a podium, right? The elevation, the number of roofs, right? So that means that the potential user or inhabitant is more or less the same for all these houses. They have kind of similar functional program or needs, right? The roof, someone mentioned the roof in the previous slide, right? So it's raining. We can guess that it's raining here. So the most efficient and rational way to protect against rain water is these steep roofs. The structure, yes, timber, wooden. In a random way, or there is a logic behind this timber structure? There is a logic. Which one is that? Is the same amount of, or the same share of timber used in all these houses? Kind of, right? Okay. And we can see that there are some, very rational grid, but at some points, there are some diagonals. This lecture is about, it's supposed to be about urban planning, but I will jump to structural systems as well, to construction, because there is no boundary. The way I see it, it all comes to how we build environment, right? So we need at least some understanding, some notions of structural systems, right? So in the corners, we can see these diagonals, what they are useful for. Do you know? Yeah, they stabilized the whole structure with these diagonals. The openings, the openings, as you may know, maybe better than me, coming from Southern European countries, windows are those parts of the facade where the heat is lost. So we need to control that. We can guess that the climate is quite cold here. So they are quite controlled. The openings are not all over the place. They are, very in proportion. If we make a percentage, if we reduce this to parametric design, giving numbers, we will come up with the conclusion that the share of timber, when it comes to materials, is quite equal. We will come to the conclusion that the share of openings, glass surfaces are quite equal. So there is this concept of typology. I would like to refer to this concept. When an architectural solution is repeated extensively, that becomes a type, a typology. And most of the times, or at least what I'm interested in, those typologies, they relate to environmental conditions. In this case, the conditions of the land, of the soil, humidity, non-stable, not solid enough, the climate conditions, rainwater, temperature, the change between indoors and outdoors, and how to control that. If we have a wider understanding even, you may know that the more compact a shape is, the more efficient it is from the climate standpoint, right? The change between indoors and outdoors becomes more efficient as you reduce the exchange surface. So the more spherical or the more compact the building is, the better, because temperature losses are controlled. So we could develop on this, and we can all refer, or we can refer all these typological conditions to climate, to environmental conditions of the surroundings, okay? So they did this. They explored these typologies in the case of the Siegen region for more than 10 years, and they used the same strategy. They photographed these typologies from the 4 different facades, and they put them one next to another. Same scale, same perspective, same size. They didn't use color, black and white, in order to reduce the complexity of reality to the minimum expression. That makes analysis easier. So, as a conclusion of this, they published several works, but I would like to mention here Framework Houses, a fantastic book compiling all this work, all this registering and recording of architecture, and also industrial typologies. In this way, in this case, water towers for the same area. So by looking at these very particular elements, they came up, well, actually they didn't, it was kind of my interpretation of the territory. I came up with a kind of narrative for the Siegen region. And what is needed for each or for every narrative that we build? Any story, we need a stage, a physical scenario, a physical space where the action happens. We need the characters, we need who is taking action there. Who are the agents? How do they relate each other, right? And finally, we need a plot, story. What do they do, these people, in this particular space, right? So what I'm going to tell you is about the history of this particular site. We talk a bit about the stage, right? Let us look at it from not so objective standpoint, not only the elevations, but how this architecture is building the urban landscape of this region. This is Siegen, the municipality of Siegen. And we can see here the different houses, right? And by addition, by repetition, by typological dominance, they built an urban landscape, in this case. Very characteristic, very strong in its identity. This is something that, at first sight, strikes us. There must be something. Whenever you find yourself in a built environment, and you see a strong identity there, you may ask yourself, what are the reasons behind that particular strong urban landscape? Typically, there are socio-environmental and economic and political, in some cases, reasons for that. And I like to think that, or I believe, that in my case, this is what interests me the most about architecture. Not architecture per se, but architecture as a disclosing device that allows me to understand deeper levels of how we live, how humans inhabit physical spaces. So this is the stage. This is a typical image of Siegen. The characters. Then you need to go deep into historical records, into archives, and to better understand how this particular stage, this landscape, was built throughout time and by whom. In this case, the Siegen region was an agrarian region for many, many centuries, right? And they developed a particular economy, a particular relationship with farming. I will tell you about later on. But it's also a mining area. Iron ore is abundant here. There are plenty of mining resources, particularly iron ore. So there is this balance between these two competing economies. And we will see how this have an impact in further steps. And there is, which is something that I'm super interested in, there is a plot. There are characters, in some cases, anonymous characters, people that we don't know about in detail. We know about their social use, their daily lives. We can get to know about that. But there are also prominent characters, people who exercise power, who have the capacity to dictate, to have an impact in the wider society, how this society lives or develops its activity, right? By publishing, in some cases, passing some regulations, some rules. And these rules, they have very much to do with architecture. I don't know if it's the case here in Poland, I think it is, but in Barcelona, and this is something that I'm quite happy about, there is no distinction between spatial urban planning and architecture. There are no specific studies for spatial urban planning. It is us, architects, who, by specializing at the end of our studies, are fully competent and are the ones responsible for urban planning. That gives us the capacity to understand regulations, norms, codes, not only as restrictions or limits, but also as devices that allows us to step forward in the future, right? Like design devices, designing tools. I will refer to that later on. So in this case, the guy we see on the screen is Hendrik Nassau, who was the count, the aristocrat, managing this area during the 18th century, right? And he passed some regulations that ultimately had a very strong impact on how these communities were built physically from the architectural standpoint. Let's go into details. Let's start by analyzing how this stage, this space is, on what are the resources, the availabilities that this particular territory offers. What is the natural capital? Two main natural capitals. First, as I mentioned, mining. Iron ore was discovered here since 10 centuries before Christ, so long ago, right? And forestry. This is an area where forestry has been abundant with ups and downs all over the years, right? So what we see on the left side of the screen is the distribution of forest and the different species. I won't go into details, but just for you to know, there has been, I wouldn't like to call them civilizations, but at least societies, that they have been using this particular resource, forestry, biomass, for different purposes, and they have had an anthropic impact on this biomass. From 400 before Christ till 200 after Christ, the dominant species was beech here, and after some time, because they didn't take care of this resource, they didn't consider the replenishment rate of that resource, they exhausted the forest. They depleted this particular resource, and it became a kind of desert for almost 400 years, right? And then they came the Franks, Carlomagno, and they reforested this with another species or two other species, oak and birch. And again, after 400 years, the forest was at risk of being depleted again. And we will see how they managed not to exhaust that particular resource. How is this translated into the landscape? If we look at aerial photos, orthophoto maps, we can discover the different components. It's not that everything is a forest. There are crops, because these people, they need to make a living. They need food, right? So not everything, we don't eat, as far as I know, we don't eat wood. We need to eat some cereals and so on. So they devoted part, or they reserved part of the landscape to the production of food. And this is becoming, I mean, try to always link these themes that may seem historical, but today these are current topics for discussion. How do we produce food as close as possible to the consumption nodes, right? Urban farming, urban agriculture, you are familiar with that, right? So these people, they had the problem solved. They had their livestock and the crops close to the residential areas. 0 kilometer consumption was, at the time, the dominant. They didn't export, they didn't import. They made a living out of the resources they had at hand, right? There is for those of you interested in that, there must be a balance between forest areas, which here are in dark colors, and areas to be cropped. Because the organic matter that fertilizes these crops most of the times comes from the forest. And typically forests are a little bit high above in altimetry from the cropping areas. Because when it rains, those forests, they decompose organic matter, and by rainwater, that organic matter is drained down to the crop fields. So it's a natural way, no effort, no extra apport of nitrates, chemicals. It's a natural process that fertilizes crops, right? And the existence of residential areas, but also we can see here some manufactured plants. Because as I said, they were also producing iron in this part of the country, right? In this part of Germany, right? So two coexisting economies here, and some natural assets like the river, the water stream, that interestingly enough, this is structuring all the crops. Most of them are close to the natural source of water, irrigation, and some infrastructures, right? How to access the different areas, roads, railways, etc. Okay, how this particular economy, and I will focus now on mining, was exploited. If we go down, and again, we need, in terms of what Michel Foucault, if you're familiar with the philosopher, claimed, we need to go back in time and to disclose reality by the genealogy of events, historical account of what has happened there. If we go back in time, we will discover these treaties, the Re Metallica. Still today, some of the indications, instructions on how to mine that were written in 1556, right, are still in place. Mining is one of the less progressive or risky economic activities. They are quite conservative, and they remain using kind of the same methods with some improved technologies, of course, but the economic cycle of mining remains mostly the same. This is an engraving included in that drawing. What do you see here? Again. And what they are using, I mean, more specific. This? Yes, that's an oven. They melt the iron ore here. Yes, that's good. So clay, as I mentioned, the soil is not that stable, so clay, it's an abundant resource, yes. What kind of fuel they are using to melt? You know that in order to melt iron ore, you need higher temperatures, right? What they are using? Timber or wood, right? These pieces here. So this is the kind of existing technology or available resource in order to melt iron ore, right? But if you know a little bit about mining and the melting process of iron, it's not enough by burning wood. You need higher temperatures that you cannot reach by just burning this fuel, organic wood. You need to transform it in something else, which is charcoal. This is what you can see here, right? I don't remember exactly the temperatures, but at least temperature triples from natural wood to charcoal, right? So this is a resource that needs some kind of treatment. So this created a kind of relationship with the environment. This is called the houseberry economy, the economy of the mountains, houseberry, the mountains on the house, on the dwelling, right? So what they did, they cultivated this particular tree, which is birch, right? And they processed it and they transformed it into these piles. Are you familiar with this process? Is this something new? They burnt it, the raw timber or the raw wood, at very slow temperature here. This takes weeks, right? They pile all the branches, all the timber that they extract from the forest, and they burnt it at a very slow pace, right? With no flame. That allows, in time, to go from this to this, right? It's a very slow process through which timber gains embedded energy because all the water is taken out of the wood, right? And that created several locations where these piles or these transformation little mountains, right, were placed over the territory, right? So it's a first, industrial, pre-industrial intervention on the territory. But what we are more interested in is in this crop field, this farm for trees, for birches, right? Again, what do you see here? Can you imagine what is? Does anyone of you read German? Okay, better so, because then we can skip this and we can focus on this. It's a farm, it's a field that it is divided, right? You see different plots. Each one of them having a number. What is your guess? What these numbers refer to? They refer to years, right? They start in 2014, if I remember, right? And more or less in a sequence, they go up in time. In time. So time is an important component here, right? What is the reason for this? Birches, the crop that they are using here, right? It has a life period or life cycle of 18 years, if I remember well, right? So if you go out to the forest and you clear out the forest all of a sudden, there will be, or in one step, the territory, the existing resource there, the forest, won't have the capacity to regenerate itself. We need to plan, or they need to plan, for regeneration. They don't cut, they don't clear the forest in one step. They divide it in different parcels, in different plots, and they, in year, let's say, 2014, that is the time to clear this particular plot, right? And after that, they need up to, if I remember well, 18 years, yes, it's 17 years from here to here, for this plot to be again available to provide that particular resource. It takes 18 years for this particular plot of land to provide adult trees that they can be cleared out again, right? Because there is a process. You first clear that particular part or plot, and then there is some couple of years that the land needs to rest and to regenerate itself, to gain some nutrients, right? And then sheep and cows come in and contribute and input some extra organic materials, right? And then you plant an in-between species, which I don't recall the name now, but it prepares, it oxygenates through the roots. It oxygenates the land. And then year 5 or 4, you are ready to plant again birches. And it takes 10 to 12 years for those birches to be adult again, to be grown up, to be mature enough so that they can produce seeds for the next generation. They don't produce seeds in the first year. They need this time, right? And after they produce these seeds, those seeds can fall down on the land, and only then, this particular plot can be cleared again. Because you have created, in this case as a farmer, the conditions so that this forest can replenish it by itself. For sustainability, there is an extremely important balance between the extraction, the speed of which you can extract resources, and the replenishment speed or the replenishment pace of that particular resource. Our problem with fossil fuels is not that they are polluting per se. Everything that we do in the environment is polluting. We are emitting to the environment. The tricky point with fossil fuels is that what it took thousands of years to create that particular resource, we are burning it at an incredibly quick, fast speed. So we are emitting all the carbon dioxide that was stored underground for thousands of years in just a moment, right? So there is an imbalance between how this resource has been replenished and the pace that we are exhausting that resource, right? So what these people did was to be aware of this balance between the speed of which we take the resource and the pace or how quick we make use of that particular resource. If you allow me, I see a very direct correlation here between urban planning, land use, zoning even, if you want, and the environment. This would be my aim, my ambition for every urban plan, to be able to find the balance point between the existing resources, right, or the availabilities of the territory, and the demands that we pose over or on top of that particular territory. For me, this is an excellent example of a wise use of a particular resource. And it all starts by planning land. We architects, I don't know if you feel the same, it was my case for many years, tend to get bored from zoning, urban planning, regulations, and so on. But if you look at it from this standpoint, from how powerful these tools can be in order to find the balance, the environmental balance, it all changes. It was my case again, right? So besides the plotting and the planning in time and programming, I prefer rather to talk about programming than planning, because program includes the time vector in the drawings. By programming, I think that we can make a wiser use of the existing resources, right? Besides the plots and the parcels, there are some other elements that are worth our attention here, right? Like as I said, one resource which is very much needed, which is water stream. All this needs an extra input of water. Not in the final stages, not in the last years of these trees, but in the early stages when they are young, they need plenty of water. So how to bring in this resource is fundamental, right? Luckily enough, they had this existing infrastructure, and how you get into the forest by road infrastructure, right? So that you can access and, facilitate or allow or provide this exchange of matter resources in this particular territory. And this, put in context, created also a social use of space, right? Communities here were organized on a yearly basis around the exploitation, the farming of this particular territory. This is a table that expands from January to December. You can follow the months, even they are in Germany. And these are the different activities that are taking place all over the year. So they are very much society, pre-industrial societies, if you allow me to use the terminology, and in simplistic ways, we can distinguish between pre-industrial societies, those societies that were in line with the existing constraints and conditions of the environment, in this case, the climate and the yearly basis, the seasonal understanding of the year, right? And their activities. Those are pre-industrial societies. What happened with industrial societies, and we'll have a look to it at the end of the session, is that we detach ourselves from the very basic natural cycles of nature, right? In this case, the seasonal episodes or the seasonal, division of the year, because energy is available. We shouldn't be, maybe yes, but given the extreme weather that we are, not extreme, but cold, let's call it cold or chill weather, we shouldn't be here if we were not an industrial society. We don't have the extra input of heating in this school and so on. So the reasonable way to act would be to remain in a more, contained environment during this season of the year. So societies are organized and their activities are organized according to the different, activities that can be developed in on the crops, right? For this farming activity. So this is the way I see it also. This can be understood as a technology. Technology is not only the transformation of matter, right, through specific tools, and this is what we can see here in the inner circle, right? For each month or each activity, there are specific tools, right? There is the development of a particular technology that is suitable or it's, allowing for this particular activity. But it's also the output, right? What you obtain, and the way we decide things also. There is governance here, if you are familiar with the term, right? How we organize ourselves in a centralized system, in a more bottom-up system, community, participatory processes. This is what happens in this particular how varies economy, right? This is what happens during the months where the land or the environment, the surroundings are resting or nothing happens there, right? Or some kind of slowdown, right? And there are pauses as well, right? So technology is not only physical material technology, but also how we organize, how we govern ourselves is a kind of technology, right? This changed dramatically with the intrusion or the appearance of fossil fuels. This is how the how very economy or this particular area of Germany is organized today. You cannot see here seasons, you cannot see here tools. Those are abstract concepts, right? And it's very difficult to disclose how the people, first, what are the agents, right? Who is living here? The characters are missing. It's a kind of very abstract organigram. It reminds me to any kind of computing system, right? It's a kind of algorithm, right? Detached from reality in a way. We'll come back to this later on. Okay, going down to architecture, to the more specific things. We've talked about land, urban planning, or if you allow me, planning or programming, how to program the usage, the land use of that particular area. By the way, this is still an existing economy, not as wide as it was in the past, but there are, besides the heritage, immaterial even heritage component of it, which makes it worth to be maintained, this economy is still running in a way. But besides that, let's focus now on the architecture. Let's go back to the typology. What can we learn from this house? or from this architectural device. Let us compare it with some of the engravings included also in the Re Metallica, the book by Agricola, which is this. What do you see? Again. It's quite obvious, I think, isn't it? Say it again. I didn't hear. Yeah. And then the material. What kind of material they are using to build both houses and mining pits? Both. Timber again. So there is one resource where two different economies compete for, right? Which is timber. It is useful for both living, right? Providing us shelter, dwellings, but also for economic activities. They need this kind of a structure to go down to the earth to obtain this resource, right? And we know that this resource is not unlimited, don't we? There was a big concern on how to make the wiser possible use of that particular resource. So I ask you, if the resource that we are relying on for these two activities or economic components of the society is limited, can we grow indefinitely? We cannot hope for this forest to be growing indefinitely. There is a limit. There is a limit which is defined by the speed how these forests are, providing this particular resource. The land is limited. It's like there is this analogy of we humans are living in a spaceship, right? Which is the Earth. That Earth, it's an ecological system that is providing some ecosystem services, but those services are limited. We are living under the illusion that resources are unlimited, right? But actually they are not. The Earth is finite, right? It's not infinite. So there are two competing interests, and they are both equally important. You cannot develop this activity without the workforce living nearby. So you need to provide shelter for that workforce. And it makes no sense having inhabitants in this particular area without an economic basis. There is this dialectical or dialogical relationship between economic activity and residential activity in this case, right? And they are all, both of them, they both rely on this particular resource, which is timber. So we need to come up with some devices, some ways to make these two competing interests compatible. And this is what this guy, Carbon Karlovich, tried to explain in this book, Silvicultura Economica, for economic forestry, right? This is the first treatise, the first work, where the word or the term sustainability appeared in Western culture, right? 1713, right? Here is a brief description of in his own terms, right? In his own words, of what are the aims or the goals of this particular theoretical or guidebook on how to exploit forest in an economic way. And it is said that this is the first time in Western history where the term sustainable show up, right? So if we go back, sustainability is not new. I mean, everyone is using the term nowadays. To be honest, I feel like not using it anymore, even though I'm running a master's program specialized on sustainability there in Barcelona. I'm planning to change the name of the master's because sustainability is so widely used that it has lost, I have the feeling it has lost its meaning. But that's not a new term. It has been used for the last 300 years, almost. Yeah. So sustainability, it's, again, if you look or read this carefully, you will see that the main goal is to identify the balance between the availability and demand, the resource and the need, the speed by which we take that resource and the speed that the natural environment needs to replenish that particular resource. So sustainability is no more, no less than that. But besides this, which is very much on the agricultural field, when it comes to one of the activities, and I will focus on the right side of the screen, right? This one, I will focus with this one, since you feel like architects, right? Not farmers. So we'll focus on that, on the architectural side. And this is a building code passed in 1756 by the so-called, let's find the analogy, the urban planning director of the area, right? It was not named like that. Carl Schell, right? 1756. And here is established how much timber can be used in order to build residential houses, in order to build this particular typology. It's limited, right? There is a limited threshold or a limit of the use of that particular resource. Now, in contemporary terms, is there any limit when it comes to concrete, when we build nowadays our buildings? Not that I know. Not that I know. Maybe here in Poland there is. But are there limits when it comes to materials? Glass, brick. All these materials, they have a tremendous impact on the environment because they carry a big amount of embedded energy. We don't see that, but the energy required to produce those materials is limited, even though we tend to think it is not. But based on our current model, energy matrix, that resource or those resources are limited. Renewable are not the main share of the energy mix today still, right? And even if they were, producing renewable energy is not as sustainable as we tend to think, right? Producing solar panels creates or poses to the environment a big impact because of all the mining materials that they need to be used and so on and so forth, right? Wind energy, everything, whatever you come up with, right? So today, if you don't say otherwise, I don't see limits when it comes to the building industry, right? So a wise understanding of the resources is posed here in a building code. Again, I cannot recall now the specific numbers, but the tons or the cubic meters of timber to be used in each building is limited. And some instructions about how to make an optimal use of that material are provided here. The dimension of the beams, how they should be displayed or put into place, right? In order to make the most effective use of that particular material, right? So a building code. And if go back, again, I won't go back to the first or one of the first slides. By applying this building code, a particular urban landscape is obtained. Something as big as the city scale may have been impacted hugely by a couple of paragraphs, by a building code. This is what I meant when I said that for me, it's super exciting to see that urban morphology, urban form, we can find the roots, the reason of that, in something as trivial, if you want, if we may think at the beginning, at first sight, as a building code, right? And this, of course, we can build timber houses without complying with that particular building code. This is what we see here, right? This is one of the former of the houses built following that code. And this is how, in the same region, the house is built today. You see the difference here I mean, besides the state of the building itself, this is quite run down, but not all of them are like this. They are quite well maintained. I took this because here you can very easily see the structural system here, right? And it has been there for the last 200 years. So if, with the proper maintenance, it should be in good conditions today, right? But today, this is the kind of usage that we are making out of this particular material, right? I don't have the exact information, but my guess is that this timber is not coming from the surroundings, right? It's imported from somewhere else. Quite sure about that, right? With all the embedded energy needed to bring in this timber from other parts of the world, right? And the excessive presence of timber. It's not needed. We know by experience, right, that this amount of beams and pillars and so on are not needed, right? Even these diagonals here, I don't know. I'm not a structural engineer, but I don't see the point of them being there. I'd rather prefer them to have them on the corners, right? So the usage of the material here is not optimal. Maybe it's complying with some other requirements like safety, earthquakes, I don't know, right? This is the kind of, balance that we need to do every time because the conditions in 3 centuries ago to here, they have changed. So it's not that we can apply directly what was done in the past to our days. We need to contextualize. But the message here is that I don't see a wise use of material here, whereas here, the material is very efficiently used, optimized, right? And this has very much to do with the scarcity of resources, with how limited they are. So at some point, I could claim for limits as a designing tool. I think this is something that you can bear in mind for the future when it comes to sustainable architecture. Limit yourselves. That would be the advice. Okay, this is what has been happening, or what had been happening in this particular area in pre-industrial period, right? During that organic age where the resources were used locally. But it all changed dramatically with the finding of fossil fuels. In this case, coal, right? Not oil yet, but coal, mid-19th century. Not very far from here, and by not very far, I mean 200, 300 kilometers from here, new mines, coal mines, were discovered in the Ruhr area region. The Ruhrgebiet, if you're familiar, it was the powerhouse of industrialization during the 19th, 20th century in the central part of Germany. Dortmund, Essen, Wuppertal, all these big cities along the Ruhr Valley, the Ruhr River, were the powerhouse. All the, German industry was located there, big companies. And it all started with the discovery of this very efficient fossil fuel source of energy, right? That fossil fuels are no more, no less than energy concentrated in very high concentrations that we can make a use of in a very instant way, right? These are the characteristics that make fossil fuels convenient for our economy. What happened? If we look at the map during that period, this is the railway map in 1861. So for this delocalization of economies, right? Economies are not local anymore because the steam machine, coal is discovered. So we need an infrastructure, a transport system, so that goods, people, resources can be transported from place to place, right? And this is, interesting enough, this map was, or this plan for the railway network in Germany was established at that time, when industrialization started to gain pace in Central Europe, right? What we can see here is the location of Siegen area, which is located here, and the Ruhrgebiet Wuppertal, in this case, where these people were obtaining this new fossil fuel, right? They could jump forward from using charcoal, which takes time, takes planning, takes programming of the existing resources, to something cheaper, faster to obtain, which is cool. The only impediment or the only thing is that the connection is not that easy. So in order, going back again, in order to obtain this, they needed the basic infrastructure, which is railway, stretching all this way. There are mountains here, right? So it was not possible or not with the technology at the time. So they came up with this railway line. And this is how the city of Wuppertal looked at the time. It was not a city, it was a village. You can see farms, right? Forest, all the things that I mentioned before, forest typically on top of hills, crops on the valleys, on the lower areas, right? And water streams draining down the organic matter from the forest to the croplands, right? And the city in the very middle of everything with a very limited extent. It's contained in relation with the available resources so far, right? But there is a new actor here. There is a new element, which is the railway, which is entering into the city for the first time. And we see here that there is a monumental building competing almost with the cathedral, right? So new cathedrals for industrialization, and the appearance of some chimneys, right? So the first industries are appearing in the outskirts of the city. So this is the photo of the Wuppertal city before the train, or as the train comes in for the first time, right? Something that we dared to do at the time is that we can, for the first time, go against the very logic of the territory, right? Because we have the energy available to do that. We have power enough to go up and down the hills with this railway, right? In the past, paths were following topography as horizontal as possible, right? Because the energy source was the animal force, right? Carriages. Driven by horses or cows or whatever, right? There was no this, availability of instant energy, big amounts of energy, right? Since we have the steam machine, right? It's possible to go up and down. So the tracing of this is a section, as you can imagine, right? A section of the railway going from Siegen to Wuppertal is not really efficient, or is not really reasonable to build, to go up the mountain and go down later on. But that's only possible because we have this energy available. Think of the many highways, tunnels, bridges that today are colonizing the territory, and they are not working in favor or according to the logic, the rationality of topography. Most of the time they are just jumping or excavating mountains because that's the shortest line, right? In terms of efficiency, in time efficiency, they are very convenient, but the impact they are having on the environment is tremendous, right? So, and this is how the outskirts of Wuppertal look like today. We may kind of go back in time in a revival way, right? They build some kind of new facade of Wuppertal towards the train. But do you see the differences here in relation with what we saw at the beginning of the lecture? Is this the same kind of typology? That could be the question. It's the same kind of typology? Yes, do you think so? What are the components? What are the elements that define a typology? Sorry? Yes. There are some slight differences, right? Yeah, but this transportation system, as far as I remember, it doesn't stop in front of the houses. This transportation system is not intended to provide access to these buildings, right? This is trans-regional transport, right? From Siegen to Wuppertal, and the station must be somewhere here, right? So you need to go there and then walk or drive a car, unfortunately, to the different buildings, right? The big difference, in my opinion, is that yes, they are using the same kind of architectural language, right? The beams and pillars, the framework appearing on the facade, right? But the dimension is a totally different one, right? This is larger. This is not single family houses. These are multi-family houses, right? And yes, there are some common elements like the roof, right? In relation with the climate, because the climate remains. But the technology changes. These are concrete buildings. They are not timber houses or timber buildings. They are concrete. And they are using this, appearance of architecture on the facade in order to go back in a kind of pastoral revival of what this landscape was at some point. But actually, this is fake architecture, if I may say, right? It has nothing to do with the real relationship with existing constraints or availabilities of resources, right? They are made out of concrete, and the social model is a totally different one. It's not the farmers living, the family of the farmer living in that house, having the ground floor as a kind of additional workshop. These are employees of big companies. I mean, they own an apartment. It's not a house. They are apartments. So if we pull the strings, we would discover the differences of this particular area in relation with the economy. And just to conclude, as we are approaching to the end of the lecture, some images of how Wuppertal looked like, and we are jumping up again in scale. This is how the city looked like in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, of the last century, so almost 100 years ago. And you could see the city and the many, roads connecting the city with its surroundings, right? The farming crops, right? And well, it was very organic in a way. And there is a new trace here, which is the railway, which is, cutting some of the roads, and some of them succeed in going down below the railway, right? Some others, they stop or they are interrupted. But for most of the cases, they succeed in crossing the train. But as we progress in time, and this might be 50s, right? Still there, but we can see how some of the crops or the plots here are, categorized, right? Or coded for future development. These are, Fabrik is the term in German, which means industries. Right? So this land is intended for industrial development. So there is an economic shift here from primary sector, agriculture, to secondary sector, manufacturing, right? Let's see how this develops. This is how it looks like maybe 10, 15 years after. Some of the roads are finding more and more difficulties to cross, right? And we see the industries being built in this particular area. Of course, the city is under economic pressure because economic activity is concentrated, right? As capital is being concentrated in this part of the city. Again, we need workforce. So these industries, they need a concentration also of residents in the city. So the city is expanding, following some urban models, urban patterns that have very little to do with the existing rationales of the landscape, right? In the past, most of them, if were any, were following the logics of the roads, right? Kind of, these suburban developments along the roads. It was, again, making the most efficient use of the existing infrastructure, the existing resource, which in this case are the roads. Now, some strange, patterns are popping up in this particular area, right? And this is how it looks like today, or more or less today, some 10, 15 years ago, maybe. You see how this area has been developed as a manufacturing area, how fragmented the city is, how specialized in terms of this is for manufacturing, this is for living, right? There are some other sectors besides the railroad. Some other speedways have showed or been built, right? With the impact of these nodes, of these exchange nodes, right? And again, some, strange, developments, suburban developments that are, popping up all over the place, right? If we put it in terms of, the footprint, the urban footprint, again, this is more or less the comparison. The urbanization process has been, having a tremendous impact on the Ruhr region. Some of the main, it was possible in the past to distinguish between Mannheim, Essen, Duisburg as distinctive urban cores, right? With agricultural areas or reserve areas in between, right? Today, it's a kind of urban continuum, right? Cities without cities. That's the model that Thomas Siebert, the German urban planning, has been describing this process, this suburbanization of the German landscape. At the end, but this is, a further step in complexity, the urbanization process has become an economic sector in itself. Real estate today is not only providing shelter or dwellings for the workforce, but it's becoming an economic sector in itself. And most of the times, and maybe you've witnessing this in the suburbs, in the outskirts of Krakow, there are developments with no use. They are just there for the sake of developers to make a profit. But this is a different story. This has to do with the financialization of economy, where we are not producing goods anymore, at least here in Europe. We are externalizing that process somewhere else in the planet, and we are very much in finding ways to make capital increase by the provision of services. But this is a story for another lecture. Okay, just as a conclusion, 3 slides showing you how this territory was, or in the past, again, this, the abundance, I could say, of resources in this particular area, the eruption of some industries, in this case, steelworks in this area, and how in time everything is becoming more and more, urbanized and intensively used through the process of accumulation of capital, right? And the delocalization of economic activities, right? And this is how it looks like today. The Ruhr area, if you are familiar with Emschen Park, I mean, the concluding story about this area is that the Ruhr region in particular is that they stopped manufacturing in the 70s or 80s last century, because again, we've seen a process of delocalization from the Siegen to the statewide economy, Germany, the Ruhr region. But more recently, we've gone to globalization. You're more than me familiar with the term, right? Where manufacturing does not happen here in Europe, it happens somewhere else, and flows of capital and goods and so on are happening globally. And the system it seems to be working, but as soon as there are some disruptions on international traffic, and I can recall now not only what is happening at the moment in the Red Sea, right, with the cargo ships being attacked, but also maybe a year ago with the we don't need terrorists to be weak. I mean, it's just a boat being, I don't know how to put it, being parked in the wrong way in the Canal of Suez, in the Suez Canal, so that the international trade of goods and the whole economy is at risk. So it seems to be resilient, but it has this global system, but it has also its weaknesses. So in my view, and I might sound a little bit, I told you so guy, in my view, going for localized economies, it's the safest possible way to keep up with the current challenges that we are facing in the coming, and we are facing not in the coming future, but we are facing them today already, right? So, concluding image, this is the Ruhrgebiet region. As I mentioned, in the 80s, it became, you know, a stage for a new social paradigm. And the big question was or is what to do with this particular territory. And they came up with this Ermchen Park project, which is a project of 200 kilometers per 30 kilometers in order to give a new content to these obsolete or industrial areas by means of transforming them into cultural facilities, into providing services rather than manufacturing. But again, this is a story for another lecture. Okay, concluding slide, the last one. What I told you so far, it's the story of a particular territory, right? By focusing on the specific, the singularity of this particular territory, how entangled the different processes are, you know, economy, land use, architecture, right? Environmental issues, right? And the opposite of that would be the formulation of a theory. As I said, I don't feel myself at this point, or maybe never, to provide a particular theory, right? But I think that since we are still focused on context, not cases, but maybe context, we should be able to provide a narrative to explain to others how, you know, the different elements, when it comes in this case to sustainability, they relate each other and they create a kind of narrative. And in the same way that we found similar characteristics in the framework houses that we were identifying, even though each one of them being singular, we may find a kind of typological understanding of architecture in that case, and typological understanding, if I may use the term, of socio-environmental issues all over the planet. And for that, and I'm, well, not at work, I'm almost concluded in building the narratives for more contexts. As I mentioned, one of them being the Amazonian Ecuador, right? A very interesting process along the Napo Valley, the American Midwest, capitalizing or building on some authors like Gropius or Rainer Banham, and this, you know, very intriguing relationship between the silos and the agrarian economy and intensive agriculture and architecture, and some other cases very spectacular in northern Sweden, where houses are not built but transported and moved all over the place in order to adapt to the different conditions. And of course, the Southern European context with the mass housing states construction, or during the 50s, 60s, 70s, where workforce and social movements and contestation was the leading narrative of this particular territory. Okay, maybe next time we will have the chance to share about one of these other stories. Okay, so so far this is my presentation today. If there are questions or things you would like to discuss, I would be more than happy to discuss them with you. So thank you.